there, welcome to Play On, the Morgan Sports Law podcast. I'm Tom Seymour, a barrister at Morgan Sports Law, and I'm joined today by my colleague Ben Cisneros, a trainee solicitor at the firm. We are very happy that we also have with us two special guests. The first is Dan Leo, who is the CEO of Pacific Rugby Players Welfare, or PRPW. Dan played for London Wasps, Bordeaux, Perpignan, London Irish and London Welsh over the course of his career and earned 39 caps for Samoa. Dan set up PRPW in 2016 and the organisation now has over 600 members. Second, we are joined by Matt Toomua, who is an Australian international rugby player of Samoan heritage. Matt, formerly of Leicester Tigers and the Brumbies, currently plays for the Melbourne Rebels and has 47 caps for the Wallabies. Matt was also very recently appointed as president of the Rugby Union Players Association, so congratulations to Matt for that. Welcome, everybody.
Hi, Tom. Thanks for having us on.
Now, in today's episode, we will be discussing World Rugby's current governance review, which was announced in June 2020. PRPW, an independent player association representing the interests of rugby players from the Pacific Islands, made submissions to the review in the form of the Velamani report. That report identified a number of issues with the governance of World Rugby that were relevant to PRPW members and to the sport as a whole. Ben advised PRPW on the drafting of its report. World Rugby subsequently responded to the publication of the report by refuting its unsubstantiated and erroneous claims regarding voting influence and other governance matters. So, with that introduction, let's move on to the discussion. And Matt, the first thing that I wanted to ask you is, you've played for Australian national teams throughout your career, and that being the case, what made you decide to get involved with PRPW?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Tom. Dan and I have a very close link anyway, so I was obviously aware of what he's been doing, particularly up in the Northern Hemisphere to start with. And once I moved up there, I'm obviously acutely aware of the situation there and, how much the Pacific Islands really contributes to the world game, whether it be in Australia, whether it be in England. And very much, as the name implies, welfare, very much concerned and focused on to helping those guys who've moved over there, moved away from home, but also just doing the right thing by rugby and giving back to the countries who have provided the sport with so much. So, very, very privileged to be a part of it. We've been on a nice long journey and I've enjoyed every bit of it.
Thanks, Matt. And Dan, what do you hope that this governance review that World Rugby has launched will achieve?
Well, good question. I mean, there's always a lot of issues when it comes to rugby and definitely Pacific Rugby. Governance right at the top of them is an organisation. I felt for a long time that if we're going to impact the state of rugby in our nations and our diaspora around the world, it's really a sense of creating a fairer playing field for Pacific Island players and those national teams at the top echelons of the sport. But that drip feeds right down to the way that the funding that goes right through the game to grassroots level. So, I think the key word for us and what we want to achieve through the Velamani report that we submitted and World Rugby's greater governance review is an increased fairness across the game. It's the key value that rugby built itself on and waves to the world. So we just want to make sure that's in line with how the game's actually operating.
And what does Velamani mean?
Velamani is the Fijian word for loving one another. Again, we feel that was an appropriate name for the report that we submitted, that mutual respect that we have on the field as players, but also off it, in the way that we conduct ourselves as people, as underpins the sport really, and it's what sets us aside. When people think about rugby, you think about the values that are behind that, and respect and solidarity really being at the forefront of those.
And so is your view that if your recommendations are implemented, it won't just be for the benefit of the Pacific nations and Pacific Island players, but also for rugby as a whole?
Yeah, exactly. Rugby's in a precarious state, as all sports are at the moment, particularly, given the new challenge of COVID. Definitely not the global game that we hope and know that rugby can be. And our belief, even before COVID was that, rugby was at a place where it needed to be embraced and inclusive of all, genders, classes, nationalities across the board. And we've seen rugby make great strides in those areas, in some of those areas, and there's still other areas that the game needs to improve upon. And we felt that we within the Vela Mani report we covered quite a few of those.
And Ben, what do you hope that the World Rugby Governance Review will or might achieve?
Well, I mean, there's a number of quite specific things I'd hope it could achieve, many of which hopefully we'll discuss today. But broadly speaking, I'd like to see a stronger commitment to the principles of good governance and to the idea of fair play for all the member unions of World Rugby. I mean, there's various sort of documents in which these ideas of good sports governance have been enshrined, the IOC's basic universal principles and the IOC's code of ethics being two examples. And I think what I'd like to see is World Rugby taking in governance a bit more seriously and trying to look at these sort of standards that have been set internationally and trying to meet them.
And Matt, perhaps more broadly, this is really about the broadest question I could ask. What do you think needs to change from a Pacific Island perspective in terms of the way World Rugby organises itself?
As a player, Tom, I think it's just in particular, from my point of view, I think it's the visibility of a lot of the nations. Yeah, look, most of the things I come in contact with is often when we get to play, a lot of the Pacific Island nations, and that's very rare. It's very much in a World Cup year, and if we're serious about growing the game, it benefits both sides, that's for sure. And if we're serious about growing the game or being the global game that Dan was speaking about earlier, we need to allow that to happen. We need to foster that. And, if we're playing a match once every 4 years against, tier 1, tier 2 nations, it's just not enough. So if we're serious about that, I think there needs to be a bit of change there. Last year we were lucky enough outside of Rugby World Cup to play Samoa in Western Sydney. I mean, if you know anything about Australia, Western Sydney's, almost very akin to up here. There's a lot of islanders there. There's a lot more island supporters than Australians, and I think we, purely from a business point of view, we can leverage from that. We can actually give back to the game, and we can grow the game in a great way and be that global game that Dan was speaking about.
That leads us on nicely to my next question, and that's that the Vela Mani report itself noted the lack of a fair programme of matches for all of World Rugby's member unions, including at World Cups. And my question is, how big a problem is this and how can it be remedied? Matt's already touched on that. So if I could ask you, Dan, what you think about that.
Matt touched on the fact that Tier 2 nations get very few matches against Tier 1 opposition outside of Rugby World Cups, which makes it more difficult to perform when you get to the World Cup, particularly if you've got shorter turnarounds than some of those bigger teams and probably less depth in your squad as well in terms of players being able to develop. The scheduling of matches at World Cups, that is the shop window for a lot of these guys. It's how they're going to get contracts moving forward. The eyes of the world, of the rugby world and the greater, sporting world are on everybody every 4 years. But the sad reality is that for the other 3 3/4 of a World Cup cycle, Tier 2 nations are very much outside of that, that reckoning. So I think, in the long term, it's not just the World Cup problem. Actually, we need to be looking at ways that we can establish meaningful competition for Tier 2 and Tier 3 nations so that there's a pathway for them to actually, be having, productive and meaningful test matches outside of World Cups.
And if I could ask a follow-up question, and feel free not to answer this if you don't want to. If we ignore World Cups and we look at the rest of the cycle, as you said, will someone who is playing test matches for, say, Samoa in that period, will they, and who, say, is based in Europe, so they're going to have to travel back for home matches, will they in fact make any money from making that commitment in terms of match fees and things like that, or will actually it just be a sort of break-even proposition?
Just from a Samoan player's point of view, and I don't think much has changed in the 5 years since I retired, you're lucky if you're breaking even. We got paid, I think, to play, for instance, to play against England at Twickenham, we got paid £400 for that match. Your wife stays with you. You put your wife up for a few days, around the game. It's very quickly gone. Definitely, in West London. So that's the reality, and it always has been. But I like to think that, in the professional era that could possibly change, but it's not going to change unless, somebody makes noise about it. And, this is why we wanted to get those submissions in the Velo Mani report. We made them public because you speak to the average punter or supporter of England rugby, a rugby supporter at Twickenham on match day. And I've done this myself. I went and did a survey and just asked them, and they had no idea that I think it was Fiji playing England that day when I went around, and they had no idea the disparity in the money that was being made available. I think England players were getting paid £27,000 to play against Fiji, who were getting £350 on the same day. In my mind, that gap's become too wide, and it's not all about money. When there's that sort of disparity, you do start to ask questions.
And what's your suggestion, Dan? Obviously, I have read the report, but maybe some of our listeners won't have read the report. What's your suggestion for trying to push back against that inequality?
Well, again, we submitted the submissions were made to World Rugby, and we feel that they've got to take greater responsibility for the state of the game. And at the moment, it does. You get the sense that it's the game's being controlled by the Tier 1 nations. I'm sure it'll come up in conversation later on, but the voting power, the fact that the Tier 1 nations have 3 votes now, and you've got Tonga, who are ranked 13th in the world, who have 0, no voting power at all, apart from the voting power that they have shared collectively under Oceania Rugby, which is, very, very tiny. So we've got this lack of influence that needs to change. That's one thing. But also, we touched on it, more matches, more meaningful matches. And then we need to look at the way that the profits from those gates, at the moment, the gate taking is all held by the host nation. So when Samoa or Tonga plays against Wales at the Millennium Stadium, Wales keeps 100% of the gate and the TV revenue, everything. But then, very rarely does a Tier 1 nation come to play us in the Pacific. And even if they did, there's just not the the buying power there to make any money from games, even if we did host them, to ever invest back into grassroots. For me, it comes down to that governance that I spoke about first, that the voting power and the influence that the richer Tier 1 nations do have becomes a block that makes it very difficult for anything to change. So that's probably where I'd start.
And Matt, can I come back to something you said earlier? You mentioned that you were privileged to play against Samoa recently outside of the World Cup in Sydney, and that was a great experience. Obviously, you've got a personal connection with Samoa. In terms of the wider dressing room, was there any feeling amongst the Australian players of sort of, we should do this more often?
Yeah, definitely look out. A lot of the rugby calendars are quite repetitive now, for good or bad or whatever. So it is always quite nice when you can play against a different nation. And look, the personal connection wasn't unique to myself. I think we have over 40% of Australian rugby professional players of Pacific Island heritage or Fijian as well. So there's there's a lot there, and to deny that connection would be silly. I think, particularly, when we talk about what Dan was talking about earlier with Fiji playing in, a sold-out Twickenham and the huge disparity between the players, I think that between the payments, I think you've got to treat it differently. How it's treated if it's Tier 1 versus Tier 1. Often they are, similar gate taking in terms of the share. However, it's understood that, England will come here for 3-match series, or Ireland will come to Australia, in which we have the chance to recuperate that, and we have the chance to kind of play our part. However, that's not the case with the Pacific Islands, and clearly that's not level footing. So there needs to be something done there, whether it's, the teams travel to the islands, or there's a fair and equitable revenue sharing model where obviously it won't be equal, but the disparity mentioned earlier is clearly far too great, and I think everyone would agree with that.
And Ben, focusing now on the World Cup for a moment, there's a section in the report which sets out a sort of statistical analysis of the unfairness of World Cup match scheduling historically. Can you briefly explain for the listeners what that statistical analysis established?
Yeah, so generally speaking, Tier 2 nations, we're talking about the Pacific Islands, maybe some of the smaller nations from South America or Europe, they've been faced with shorter rest breaks between their matches, or certainly shorter rest breaks before their most important matches. Their big games against the heavy hitters of World Rugby, or against their sort of closest rivals. So that's really the big issue. And in terms of the stats, in the 5 World Cups from 2003 to 2019, in which there were 10 Tier 1, 10 Tier 2 nations in each tournament, on only 17 occasions has a Tier 2 union had 20 or more days to complete their pool stage fixtures, giving an idea of the number of days off they're likely to have had. Whereas Tier 1 unions have had that privilege 44 times.
And Dan, you've been to World Cups with Samoa. Was this something, I guess it must have been, but was this something that was a point of discussion amongst you and your teammates, how unfair the scheduling was?
Oh, I'll tell you what, with Samoa, it was probably the least of our issues. When we got to a World Cup, we were just happy to be there. Yeah, when we got there, particularly in 2011 in New Zealand, the last World Cup that I played in, we had to play Namibia on a Wednesday, and then we were playing on a Sunday against Wales. And our match against Wales was always going to be the decider, really, of the pool, with South Africa in there as well. We lost our frontline 10 against Namibia, and we didn't have them against Wales, and we lost by a close margin. And I think if we'd had Tusi Pisi that day playing at 10, things could have been very different for us. And yeah, so I think that's the hardest thing when you're a player, and the pinnacle of the sport is a World Cup, obviously, and you work so hard to get there. And there's a lot of hurdles that you have to jump over and crawl under, whether you're a Tier 1 nation player or a Tier 2 player nation. Everyone works. It's hard to be there. And when you look back and you think, oh, geez, if only we'd had an extra 2 days, we might have had that guy, and we might have been there, and then we might have been in a quarterfinal. You don't want to have those questions as players at the end of your career. And I'm at the end now where I'm reflecting. You don't necessarily have the time to, as I say, during the competition, but it's back. It's 2 years, 3 years on that those regrets start to hurt even more. Sorry, mate, I get a bit emotional about these kind of things. That's the reality of the situation, and you feel for it.
Moving back to the World Rugby Governance Review briefly, given the manner in which that review has been set up, do you think that change is realistic? And if I could ask you that first of all, Dan.
It's a good question. We're hopeful that change can be a result of this. We wouldn't have bothered working with Ben to put the Velamani report together if we hadn't thought that was, that there was a glimmer of hope there. I guess the key barrier to it all is the makeup of the panel, the review panel. It was labelled by World Rugby, and they made a big sort of fuss about it. An independent governance report, but actually it's only effectively independently led. Straight away, we saw when we lodged the Velamani report, we saw kickback from World Rugby saying that we were only going to be accepting submissions from from recognised players associations. I think they said was the key word, which PRPW doesn't come under strictly because we refuse to take funding from them, so we're outside of their funding circle. To blatantly say that you won't take submissions from anybody outside of that funding circle for me is a bit of a red light, a warning light comes up there. And saying that, we've got a lot of trust and faith in Hugh Robertson to get the right outcomes for the game. And actually, I think within World Rugby itself, they do want to see change. They want to see the game grow and become a global sport, as Matt was alluding to. But we really need to see some sort of reform come out of this. Hopefully, it can happen.
And Ben, without wishing to prejudge the review, do you think that, given the manner that it's been set up, change is likely to occur?
I think we're probably going to see some change. I think the fact it's being led by Sir Hugh Robertson, chairman of the British Olympic Association, there's clearly an intent there to produce some sort of findings that can affect change within the organisation. I don't think they'd have gone out and found someone of his calibre to head a review if there wasn't going to be some change coming from it. But that being said, I am concerned about how effective the review can be, given the conflicts of interest that exist within the working group that is conducting the review. So there are 3 independent members, Sir Hugh Robertson, Sir Peter Cosgrove and Angela Ruggiero. But Ruggiero is on the World Rugby Executive Committee herself. Then you've got the heads of the French, Welsh, South African and Argentinian federations. And then you also have the World Rugby chairman and CEO in the working group. And I'm concerned about how effectively this group will be able to conduct a thorough scrutiny of the organization's governance when people that are heavily personally invested in the organization are at the core of that review. And I personally would have preferred, and I'm sure Dan would agree with this, to have seen a completely independent review. And we saw that, for example, with the World Athletics Governance Review and also the International Cricket Council's Governance Review in 2012, that one being led by Lord Wolfe along with PwC. And I think that strongly independent review would be more likely to produce effective change, in my opinion.
And moving on then to the governance of the game in the Pacific Islands and what role World Rugby plays in relation to that. Dan's already mentioned that a particular characteristic of Pacific Island rugby is that there can be quite a large degree of political involvement or political interference, you might say. And certainly a surprising closeness between the state and rugby. How does that ultimately affect players, do you think, Dan, that situation?
It's tough, when you've got your Prime Minister arriving into the country and waking you up at 4 a.m, the night before a test match, to give a G-up speech, or pulling out players because he prefers, the Samoan Sevens team's done well that weekend and he wants to see a few of the Sevens boys in the 15s, and just coming and totally, picking his own team. It can be interesting. Again, it's what Maddie touched on, and Ben to a certain degree. There does need to be change there. I think the proximity and the presence and some of the issues that we encounter with the involvement of politicians and just overall bad governance at times is symptoms of the wider issues in the game. It goes back to that influence and the profit share, the way that money is being redistributed in the game. Because you go to the islands and, I've done this and I've spoken to the CEOs there, and it's just, there's just no money. And there's nowhere to go apart from to the government. And, the government of Samoa, to their credit, funds a heck of a lot of, of the game there. Only 30% of the money necessary to run the Samoan Rugby Union is provided by World Rugby. 10% comes from, a small amount of sponsors that they do have. And then the other 60% comes from government. And with that money comes, there's special strings attached. They're not just going to give that money without having one of their guys sitting at the top of the rugby unions. I guess the question to chuck back at you is, how do we move away from that model? Is it the fault of the Pacific Island unions, or is it the system? Is the system actually designed to keep things this way? It's not as easy as saying that we just can't have government officials involved in rugby in the Pacific, because you take government out of the Pacific rugby, we don't have rugby teams. There's no easy solutions here.
I'll pass that difficult question on to you then, Ben. How do we move away from that?
Well, I think Dan hinted at it. It all comes back to the commercial model that the game operates, and it feeds back to what we were speaking about earlier about potential revenue sharing, more tests for these nations against other big opposition, or at least high profile matches. Because I think really it's a vicious cycle. These nations are generally unable to host test matches or unable to generate much money from them when they do. That leaves them in a state where they can't generate income, they can't fund themselves, and they're not getting any money when they play abroad either. So that's why they turn to government. So I think if World Rugby can find a way to ensure that when these nations play matches against wealthier countries, they're able to take something away from that, they're able to generate revenue from these games, then that should reduce the need for this public funding and therefore reduce the involvement of government, which in itself should allow the countries, the nations, to govern themselves better in a sporting sense. And then with that better sports governance, hopefully will come further commercial opportunities. Because at present, what sensible rugby business person would want to go into business with, for example, the Tongan Rugby Union? Most sensible business people wouldn't. But if you can break the cycle of underfunding and therefore reliance on the government, which in itself leads to poor governance, hopefully, by raising the overall standards in these unions, they'll be able to become self-sufficient.
Do any of you think that the development of club rugby, or the equivalent of club rugby in the Pacific Islands, has a role to play? We focus only on national rugby at the moment.
I think it certainly could. I think if it's funded in the right way and structured in the right way, it could certainly provide revenue for the unions. If it was, for example, owned, let's say a Pacific club rugby team was created and it was co-owned by the Fiji Rugby Union, the Samoa Rugby Union and the Tongan Rugby Union, for example, then of course any commercial success that team has can be then distributed amongst those unions. And then those unions would be able to invest in the grassroots game, and they'd be able to develop their pathways to bring players through. And hopefully then they'd be able to hang on to a few more of their top players, and we'd see less of this player drain effect that we've seen for so long.
I think that's the nail on the head. Really, is the national sides are the drivers of the revenue that feed the grassroots in any level. That's why Australian Rugby Union puts so much money into the Wallabies, and the same for the RFU with England. And they see they invest. It's seen as an investment from their unions they put into the top teams, and that filters down to grassroots. We're not seeing that return. We're not seeing that investment into our top sides. As Matt said at the start, there's a lack of visibility for teams, and then ultimately that means that has a massive impact on grassroots. So I see a lot of and maybe in tier one nations, it makes sense to broaden that base of the pyramid, so that you have the broader the base of the pyramid, the higher the higher you can go, and that's the concept you want to build upon. What we're seeing is that our pyramid is actually upside down. There's a huge drain of players from the islands at a very young age, and we see not just from rugby union, but we see rugby league now. The NFL had first, traditionally they've only been based in American Samoa. They ran scouting camps in Western Samoa or Apia in the last 2 consecutive years. So, the NRL competition is, in line with what Maddie said, those stats of 40 to 50% of Pacific Islanders in rugby union. It's probably even higher in the 16 teams in the NRL rugby league competition. The Sharks are circling, and the Pacific Islands have always been traditionally seen as a bit of a breeding ground and a conveyor belt of talent, of an endless conveyor belt. And the reality is, it's not an endless conveyor belt. It definitely, again, Samoa and Tonga are very small populations, and we're hearing instances now of Tonga losing their top 40 schoolboys every year, constantly to go into a top-up year of, on a scholarship at either Australia, New Zealand, or England or Wales now around the world. And in a country of, with a rugby population of 8,000 people, to lose your top 40 players every single year, it's a massive drain. And the only way you're going to change that is to have some sort of pathway, something that's going to hold those players there. And at the moment, aspiring to play for Tonga is not the pathway required, because again, for all those reasons that we've mentioned. In the case of the Pacific Islands, it's got to be investment into the top before we can start looking at investing into the bottom, if that makes sense, Tom.
And in terms of the social impact of that great movement of young players away from the Pacific Islands, whether to Australia or New Zealand or Europe, Matt, in your experience, perhaps from your time in Europe, what have you seen in terms of the difficulties that young Pacific Islanders can face when they move many thousands of miles away from home?
Anyone moving thousands of miles away from home is going to struggle. You see it with the Pacific Islanders, you see it with a lot of the South African guys as well, particularly the Afrikaans-based players. The thing I probably want to touch on is the incentive to go back and give back to your country at the moment is so low. If you're playing in France on a decent wage, and then you want to go play for your country, whether it be Fiji, Samoa, or Tonga, for less money, and for a company a union which you suspect is not governed in the best way it could be, in fact, and could be a lot worse, your incentive to go back is almost nothing. And that's, as Ben alluded to earlier, it's a vicious cycle. If you're guaranteed a good wage overseas, why would you go back and give back to that? And if that's the case, then the team's not going to do well on the public stage. And in terms of visibility, it's not going to be great when these tier 2 unions are losing in big matches. So it kind of starts at the top, as Dan said. Unfortunately, you do have to invest in the top in this case, and governance is probably the first issue here, because purely from a player's point of view, I know players aren't keen to go back to a small island with poor conditions on less money with a union that you may suspect is corrupt. And if that's the case, then it's never going to get rectified if that continues.
Touching now on another issue raised in the report, and that's French academies in Fiji and the impact on young Fijian players. Ben, perhaps if you could explain or give a background to that issue.
Yeah, so what we know from various media reports internationally and from Fiji is that there are at least two or three, I understand, French clubs that have essentially academies set up in the Fijian Islands to get young players involved with these clubs from a very early age to identify the top talent with a view for them then going over to Europe, going over to France, and obviously eventually making it into the first team for those clubs. I think Dan's probably better placed to talk about the impact that has, but just from a legal sort of regulatory perspective, that's not allowed under the World Rugby regulations. Regulation 4 specifically addresses this issue and makes clear that it's absolutely not on, and yet it continues to happen, and it happens publicly. It's not a secret. Everyone knows that it happens. World Rugby knows that it happens, and yet nothing has been done to change it, and that is, for me, very alarming.
Dan, what can you say about the impact in your experience of that setup?
The impact is real, not only with France now, but with Japan coming into Samoa and Tonga and offering scholarships to university on the basis. When I used to play for Samoa, we used to beat Japan by 30 or 40 points, and now they beat us by that much, but they've got 4 or 5 Samoans playing for them, and that's the reality of if we turn out a blind eye to these situations. And a lot of those guys are coming through and aspiring to play for France now. With the eligibility changes, you've got to have lived in a country for 5 years now, and so nations are using these academies to bring players over so that they can, by the time they're 20, they've lived in France for 5 years, because they're bringing them over at 15 or 16. For us, that's too young. We're obviously in contracts this year. Last year, the first one was a kid coming from Tonga that was leaving, and he was 13 years old. He wasn't to play for Tonga; he's to play for Japan. So, how's that a good thing? And what are the governing body doing to regulate these situations? You can't just continually pass the buck. You've got to confront them at some stage. Otherwise, it's a slippery slope. Yeah, I mean that's what why we're here as an organisation, to try and hold them to account on this. But we need to see change on all of these issues, particularly this one. For me, it's a one that's very close to my heart.
Can I just ask a follow-up? Sorry, I don't know if Matt or Dan wants to come in on this, but in terms of the impacts on these players, these young players, that let's take the Fiji guys as an example, the ones that are going across to France, what's the social impact on them being in France so far away from home? Do you want to just touch on that?
We've seen across the board, this isn't just the Pacific Island thing. This is, rugby players and probably men in general. Mental health issues have been massively on the rise. I think the risk when you see players coming across and committing to a career in rugby so early on, it's a lot of pressure, particularly on a young guy who's leaving home at maybe on average, maybe 16 or 17 years old, and and the hopes of a village and the family and the village and the church are all on this guy, that he's going to go and make it. He's going to become the next Jonah Lomu or Torai Kefu. And the reality is that that's probably not going to happen. Not to that extent. It could, but it's it's a lot to deal with. And so we, I guess, as an organisation, was at the heart of setting up, as we saw a lot of mental health issues. We've got the highest rates of youth suicide in the world in the Pacific Islands anyway, and that's just exemplified and probably heightened when there's 10 times, 100 times more pressure on these young guys going over to France to earn money to send back home. So yeah, the social impact on that, that's purely from an economic point of view. Then you add on top of that the difficulties that they can have with the language and the culture and all of that.
Have you had any first-hand experience of that, Matt, with Pacific Island players?
Yeah, definitely. There's a huge pressure there, but at the same time, a lot of people still choose to do it, and that doesn't mean that we just let them be now. There's got to be a lot of support there. I said this before. It benefits the club, it benefits the union to do that, rather than just bring players over and leave them to their own. You'll get a better player if there is a lot of better support, and I think that's why organisations like PRPW are crucial for that, because whilst it's concerned with the welfare for the player, it has a material effect on the club, and it benefits the club, and hence why the club should be incentivized to invest in that place and help, their players who are obviously facing a lot of challenges, because it is unique. Myself, for instance, I go over to England to play, and I'm not worried about supporting a suburb back in Australia. It is completely different. Whereas, a lot of the island guys, and Dan doesn't exaggerate when he says this, they have a village, aware of what's going on, and hoping that a bit of money comes through, or, and that's a lot of pressure for a young man, or for any man to take on. And in particular, if they are, in their early 20s or even earlier, I don't think you're setting yourself up for a sustainable system there.
And then if we move on finally to voting rights on the World Rugby Council, one issue of particular concern to Tier 2 nations, perhaps the biggest issue, and we've already touched on it, is the fact that they are weighted unequally and in favour of the established unions. So if I could go to you first of all, Matt, obviously you're a player for Australia and therefore for one of the dominant Tier 1 nations. Is this something that you've previously considered, the unequal voting rights? And if so, how does it make you feel? Do you feel instinctively that it's unfair? Why should it be like that?
Yeah, look, from an Australian rugby player's point of view, it's obviously serves us well. But I think in terms of the broader the game, look, quite frankly, Tom, nothing's going to change unless that changes. Everyone votes in their own interests, and if you're not given much chance to voice your opinion or you put your case forward, then of course no one's going to look out for that. So it's pretty simple for me. That's nothing's going to change unless that is amended. Which I spoke about visibility earlier on. There's going to be no visibility if countries don't even have a vote, or if their vote is half of another country's. And you can look at it in different other areas, whether it be politics or whatever. It would be pretty. Yeah, if you draw comparisons, no one would agree with that.
And Ben, just briefly, are you aware of any other major international sports federation where the voting rights are unequal or unequal to that extent?
Not in this way. There are various different ways that federations structure their voting. Sometimes it's done by association, and then different associations get a different number of votes. But I think that's mainly based on their size rather than their historical influence. So no, it's as far as I can tell, it's pretty unparalleled. And
Dan, what are your views on this particular issue, or what would you like to say?
I'm not totally in disagreement that there should be some sort of tiered voting system. In a perfect world, would have a one vote, one country, one vote system. But let's be honest, we're so far from that. That even bringing it a little bit closer would probably be a step in the right direction as some sort of compromise. And also, you give an incentive to some of those countries who aren't displaying, good governance at the moment to aspire to maybe a second vote. I don't think anyone should have 3 votes when there's countries that don't have any votes and you're a top 20 nation. I think that the gap's too far. So again, it's about, not necessarily abolishing the system, but bringing it a little bit closer. I question whether it's actually achievable for, countries like the Pacific Islands to ever achieve the 3-vote status. And that's a problem, because if you're going to have this weighted system, it's got to be achievable for all nations. And if it's unachievable, then we need to look at how we can make, that influence greater, more fairly weighted.
Well, unfortunately, Dan, that currently is unachievable, because the third vote given to these Tier 1 unions is given to them on the very basis of their membership of the Six Nations or Rugby Championship. Now, that's explicitly stated in World Rugby Bylaw 9, which deals with the voting rights. And the issue is that these are privately owned, privately run competitions. And the Tier 2 unions aren't part of those competitions, and are very unlikely to become part of them because the owners don't really want to open them up, certainly at this stage. So at present, there is no way for the Tier 2 unions of the Pacific Islands to get that third vote, even if they did have the commercial power to get the second vote, because the second vote is dependent on all sorts of commercial criterion. So it is currently unachievable, and I'm inclined to agree with you that that's not a satisfactory position. The 10 major unions that have the 3 votes hold just under 60% of the overall voting power, which means that for the election of the chair of World Rugby, which only requires, it's done on a simple majority vote, that election could be won with the support of just 9 member unions of World Rugby, bearing in mind that World Rugby has a membership of over 100 unions. There are 9 sufficiently powerful unions to win that election alone, which is bizarre.
Well, on that sadly slightly negative note, we will wrap things up because we've run out of time. Thank you very much to Dan and Matt for joining us and for being so generous with their time. For analysis and articles on athletes' rights issues, please go to our website, www.morgansl.com. If you're interested in signing up to our mailing list, or if there are any topics that you would like to see addressed in a future podcast, please email us at podcasts@morgansl.com. Finally, please connect with us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook for articles, updates, and news pieces. We hope that you've enjoyed listening and that you will join us for future episodes of Play On.